what is our relationship to each language? What are the feelings that each evokes for us? What is that language of the crib? What is that language of the home? What is that language of the womb that really evokes wonderful memories for us? What is that language most attached to trauma? What is that language attached to love? Saludos and welcome to the Rematriating Boriken Podcast, where we discuss the journey to the essence of these islands, this archipelago and her surrounding waters, the restoration of our essence before conquest and continued colonialism, the reclamation of our collective healing and liberation. I am Yasmín Hernández, creator of CucubaNación, artist, writer, activist, born and raised in Brooklyn, Rematriating Boriken. There's been a lot that has happened since the last new moon and the last episode 9, that I shared about the loss of Dave Siapagan. It feels like a lot of time has lapsed in between that new moon and this full moon. It feels like well beyond 2 weeks. It's been an intensely challenging time. Many losses that we are learning of. Very beloved, respected elders. I'm seeing also a lot of personal losses in the lives of different people in my circle, and also challenges with health and other issues, loved ones in my own circle and beyond. So I want to take this moment to acknowledge those of us going through these challenges. How many of us have set out to do things that we want and need to do, but have been intercepted by circumstances beyond our control? Want to emphasize the importance of self-care, the importance of caring for one another and loving up on ourselves and each other in these times of challenges, of grief. Grief comes in different forms. It doesn't just come in the form of losing somebody to a transition or death. It also comes in the form of grieving transitions in chapters and phases of our lives. Sometimes our loved ones don't appear and cannot appear as they used to, whether they be moves, whether they be health challenges and other things. So this right now seems to be a time of that, right? Of having to face a lot of the things that we cannot change or control, and the necessary call to channel grace, the necessary call to channel grace and patience in light of that, as we face that. So with that said, I'm shifting a bit the theme of this episode. This is an episode that's been floating around for a couple of months, and now seems like the right time to present it. I think of this as a lighter theme, the theme of language, and in this conversation even incorporate some humor to talk about how my own family has navigated those issues of language over there in New York City and here in Boriken. But for some people, language continues to be a deep trigger. And so it may not feel as light of a conversation to some, but it is important to discuss. And I certainly want to discuss it now as I move into featuring more of the folks I've interviewed for this project for Rematriating Boriken and the portrait series. Many of those conversations happen in Spanish. Some happen in English, some happen in Spanish, some are in Spanglish. So now feels like a good time for a pivot and to talk about something that could be a bit humorous. Really, language also, I think, is, even though it is a trigger for many of us, it's also a site for incredible creativity and imagination, and in the ways that our people survive, and ways that our people figure out how to thrive by the way we play with things like language. And I think it's beautiful to see evidence of that when you think about Nuyorican poetry, right? So even with the challenges, there's so much to celebrate in how we have worked with language over years, decades, centuries, at least. So here are my reflections on language. I had gone into this podcast assuming that it would be an English podcast. But I think by virtue of the fact that I'm bilingual, this will inevitably be a bilingual podcast. I think that in the episodes I've already recorded, I may throw in some words or phrases or expressions in Spanish, though I'm speaking the majority in English. Rematriation is a conversation possibly coming from outside the archipelago and then being in it, considering what it means for this place. What are the ancestral practices already in place that are rising as rematriation? Those of us returning here, those of us arriving to live for the first time, what are the practices that are unfolding organically for us, and how are we tapping into long ancestral practices have already been here? And so this conversation comes from both sides. When I started the Rematriation gatherings at CucubaNación in Mayagüez, those spaces, it was important that they be safe spaces. So, okay, we're going to have these spaces where people could speak in English and not be judged or not be criticized for not speaking Spanish or speaking Spanish in a way that's not as proficient as their English or fluent. What I learned in the first few months was that rematriation was not exclusive to people who were moving here from outside the archipelago. Was understanding that some people were moving here for the first time, like myself. Others of us had been from here and had to leave for whatever reasons and were coming back. And then I started to see that some of the people, this is like lo más obvio, that the people who were most representing for rematriation were the people who had never really lived outside of the archipelago, who were living, lifelong experiences, generations-long experiences of being aligned to the original essence of this place. And what I came to understand is that rematriation then became a relationship between all these various experiences. I've given you 3 rematriation experiences, and it doesn't even stop there. It's expansive. We can't contain it. We can't label and pinpoint everything. So that fluidity, right? That is everything, as is our language. So there may be times that I'll invite someone on this podcast to speak that will speak largely in English, or that will speak in Spanish, or that will speak in Spanglish. And my interest is to let language be fluid, and for the listeners, y'all could be fluid too. Si se identifican con los episodios que son en español, van a escuchar aquellos. Si se identifican con los dos idiomas, bienvenido. If you identify with the English-speaking podcast, and welcome to the English-speaking podcast. And if you flow with the bilingual ones, you flow with the bilingual ones. If you want to use this as a lesson on language and practice your English or your Spanish, si lo quieren utilizar para practicar su inglés o lo que sea, fluir con estos episodios. I don't want to do a bilingual episode where every single thing that is said is translated, porque es muy cansón. And so I just believe in the power of flowing, the power of fluidity with language. So some thoughts on my own self and language. The fact that I was 39 when I moved here, had lived my entire life in the US and had been born there. And so language for me meant that I, as a preschooler, spoke equally English and Spanish. Once I started school and learned more to read and write in English in Brooklyn, then the English came to dominate and I started to lose my Spanish. Most of my cousins, most of my peers spoke English, which is what I spoke mostly. I mostly spoke Spanish to my father, and then mostly spoke English to my mother, but my mother spoke both languages. My husband says that my mother is perfectly fluent in Spanglish, and it's true. If you hear her speak, then she'll go completely back and forth, or one sentence is half and half. That's how she speaks. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, did not speak English, and they lived from the age of 8 to the time I went to college. I lived like 10 blocks or so from them. So I would see them at least on a weekly basis, and would speak to them entirely in Spanish. And so I was the youngest of my generation, which meant that most of the cousins I played with were actually my second cousins. They were actually my cousins' children. And so with the second cousins, most of them did not speak Spanish. My cousins that were more of my peer group, and then, my cousins and siblings who were also Gen X, but kind of slightly older than I. We were all Gen X, but talking about our ages, right? It runs the gamut. You're talking about like a span of 20, 25 years in this generation. But the older ones definitely spoke Spanish fluently. And I may have been on the tail end of the younger people of that generation to have spoken Spanish. Still, when I came to Puerto Rico, when I was 10, I realized, you cannot hang with the Spanish. Y yo me tragaba las palabras. My mind would literally draw a blank, to the point that I was once trying to speak to my cousins in Ponce. Y no me llegaban las palabras, and I just started bawling from the frustration. So that was the first time that I encountered what it was to navigate these bilingual worlds and feeling more proficient in one side than the other. And it wasn't a frustration around not being able to express myself. The frustration was I was so excited to be around all my cousins. I had all these cousins. I had a zillion cousins that were my age, and couldn't communicate, couldn't really build that rapport that I wanted por falta de esa fluidez. I pretty much returned to the States and just don't really speak Spanish anymore. Like, I think that como que algo me traumó to the point that it was like, whatever, I'm just going to stay with the English. When I graduate college, my first job out of school was taller puertorriqueño in Philadelphia. Taller puertorriqueño, pero yo trabajaba con una venezolana, con una peruana. Trying to think what other cultures might have been represented. And the point is that a lot of the people that were there representing Puerto Rico were first generation like myself, or had moved. Many of them had recently arrived from Puerto Rico. And by my second year, I was working with students that had literally just arrived from Puerto Rico. So they only spoke in Spanish. They were speaking English, they understood and could get by in English, and they were going to public school in Philly. But if you let them day to day to their own devices, se expresaban en español. And I was learning slang that I did not know, because my Spanish came from my grandparents who left in 1950, or my father who left in the late 50s, right? I was speaking a Spanish that was from Puerto Rico of the 50s, y ahora están llegando estos nenes in the late 90s from Puerto Rico directly. And so I was forced, like, a staff meeting at Taller Puertorriqueño, for the most part, was held entirely in Spanish. If someone spoke English, that would have been me. Si se decían unas palabras en inglés, eran unas palabras en inglés. And so there I was in my mid-20s learning or having to get by in a professional setting, speaking Spanish. And by that time, I was already with my husband, who, and that's a whole other conversation, the clash of Colombian Spanish meets New York Spanish. But there has been so many influences of other Spanish in my Spanish that folks have a hard time
pinpointing where my Spanish is from. I'm now having these Spanglish situations in reverse. So the other day I saw something. I thought it was in serious. I remember because here se dice en serio, right? En serio would be the translation of seriously. I don't say seriously. I'll always say yo serious. Pero aquí es en serio, en serio. That's what you always hear. And so you get into these moments and without even thinking, you do a literal translation. And I busted out que si in serious. And I just started cracking up because it was so instantaneous. There was not even a thought behind it. What has also been happening here is that my son, my youngest son in particular, who arrived at 2, but is in a household that is largely speaking in English, he will invent his own Spanglish. So one of his most common words is boringo. Boringo is, I don't want to do that, it's boring. It's boring. It's boringo, okay? Like he won't use the term aburrido. It's boringo, right? And he'll just read stuff sometimes that's English in Spanish. For example, our last fridge was when they were sitting in the kitchen, I hear him say frigidaire. And I'm like, what the hell is frigidaire? ¿Qué rayo es eso? And I'm looking around the whole kitchen trying to understand what he's talking about. He points to the fridge, frigidaire. And it wasn't even frigidaire, it's frigidaire, which sounded like such the perfect New Yorker word. But I'm now seeing how we as a family are the inverse of what my grandparents experienced, which is go to the States, people make fun of you or people shame you for speaking only Spanish and not speaking English well. Of course, we get the opposite here. As a teacher, I used to get shamed. Over there, children would get shamed by their teachers. Here, I would get shamed by my students for not speaking English or not speaking Spanish correctly. The irony, and what I learned when I started teaching here, my second year here, is that even though I felt that I was fluent enough to go into a classroom, when it wasn't until I got into that classroom that I realized that as an artist, my entire art career has been in English. So there are very specific terms to art and art making and art materials that I did not have any translations for. And that was really bugged. We can hold it down with conversational Spanish, but when we're taken out of that and put into a professional setting, or are needing the language that is specific to our profession or specific to certain scenarios, it may be then that you will find, holy shit, yo no tengo la herramienta, yo no sé cómo rayo decir eso. Warm colors, colores cálidos. Yo nunca he tenido que decir colores cálidos. Every day I was finding myself literally having to research terms and words that I just had no idea. I have had to help them through their Spanish grammar over the years at school, which the irony that it is that the majority of that grammar I never learned. So where I may have learned how to conjugate verbs in New York City public schools, what I learned around conjugating verbs is like the tip of the iceberg compared to what some of these kids are learning. Ya by like 3rd or 4th grade, lo que estos chicos saben es una locura. Esto de los llanos y las agudas y like just all these rules around Spanish grammar, acentuando y todo eso. Es como que es drújula y subdrújula. Like I have heard words that I've never heard in my entire life. I need to say that the best advice I was given before coming was that bilingual schools here are not bilingual schools in the States. Bilingual schools here are really actually emphasizing English. It means that all instruction and all books are in English with the exception usually of just the Spanish class, like happens right in the States. That's not a bilingual program, or it's not like what the States would call a dual language. Dual language is also different. My cousin Monique explained that to me, that like they're basically doing everything parallel 2 times in both languages so that they have the full immersive bilingual experience. Here, over there, bilingual was like teaching English, right? ESL, right? English as a second language. Donde aquí, bilingual is we're going to take your Spanish speaking child y meterle inglés por un tubo y siete llaves. But we'll give them in Spanish class in Spanish, and we'll give them history class in Spanish. And if I could do it again, I don't regret the school that we chose, but if we could do it again, I would have put my children in an entirely Spanish school and immersed them, because it would have been easier. It would have been traumatic then, but it would have been an easier transition because they're sponges and they pick up the language. Whereas the older they get, the harder it is to bring the language in. So speaking to how we use language, and the fact that my grandparents left in 1950, my father in the late 50s. So it's something that we have to consider. I think it was 2008, when there was a recession of 2008, and leading up to that point, things economically were starting to change in Puerto Rico. And that's when some folks were starting to move, in greater numbers to the States, because up until that time, most of my youth, my adolescence, I feel, I was kind of static. If you were a Brooklyn Rican or a New Yorican, then you had just been there. And most of the people around you had been there. I did not have the experience that folks were arriving recently from Puerto Rico and New York. I had that experience in Philadelphia, living there in the late 90s, but I did not have that experience in New York, which is to say then that I was raised within a New Yorican culture and language, right? Los anglicismos que nosotros usábamos, things like behman, bakery, specific to my time there. When I came here and before I moved here, I was really shocked to learn that there were other anglicismos here that were being used that we did not use in New York. So, for example, at shopping for the shopping mall, lo fafu for fast food, I thought those were like ridiculous. I still do. So to know that the slang here and the anglicisms that are okay, how's this? We may have been criticized, or still may be criticized, for the Spanglish that we speak as New Yorkers or as whatever Boricuas from the diaspora, if we're coming from the States or English-speaking countries, because I also don't want to give the impression that everybody only lives in the States. But to say that, that the Spanish que se habla aquí no es tan sagrado, because and this is taught, my son in 6th grade just went through another segment of this, which is los puertorriqueñismos, which are laced with africanismos, as they're called, africanismo being so darn broad, right? But speaking to the words that we get from our African ancestors, and then lo anglicismo, the influence of over a century of U.S. colonialism and how that has influenced our language. And then los tainismo, I think they're called, which are all the words that have come to us from the Arawak language that they didn't come to us, the words that have already long been here. Within that, our language is very unique. As Boricuas, we speak a Spanish that could be very distinct from, we know this from regional Spanish. There's been so many programs on this, and so much written about this, that Spanish is not homogenous. And what is Spanish is another question to ask if we consider Spain and all of its many regions and languages. Something else to consider. Pues sí, when we come here, we come and bring our own bilingualisms and our own anglicisms, perhaps in the Spanglish that we may be speaking, but to also know that there's a whole other collection of it happening here already. So I think that the important thing to demystify that sort of fear, apprehension, or like a self-consciousness that we may sometimes feel, a shyness, a timidness, and it's almost a shame, right? Like perhaps we were shamed in our respective home communities about not speaking Spanish, or perhaps it's a shame we have felt ourselves when we have been in the presence of other Spanish speakers and we cannot speak Spanish like that. Like, I have found it interesting that for the political, let's say some of the political judgments or critiques that I had of Cuban American communities, right? That when times that I have spent in Miami feeling like a lot of the Cubanos and Cubanas that I was meeting, like many young Cuban Americans speak Spanish. And so I have wondered about communities that were more successful at maintaining Spanish with different generations. I cannot speak for that any longer. I recognize my age and that I am not connected with these different cities and their respective communities to know what the situation is today. So within those stories de los anglicismo and that concern about our children not speaking Spanish was a time that we took our children when they were younger to a playground. And at this playground, there were a couple of classmates that happened to be there, and they started this soccer game. And my oldest son, who's not very athletic, but would play soccer in school with the kids before classes would begin in the mornings. And he had just been sitting there quietly while he watched his friends playing soccer. Some of them were on teams and played more actively. And so he was just sitting observing. And so I don't know what happened in the game because I am not the sports person, whatever. His dad is Colombiano. That's a whole other story for soccer. Knows more than I do, or football, hablando de anglicismo. And all of a sudden, this child puts his little finger in the air and shouts out, penalty, penalty. And I looked at him like, what did you say? Penalty. And he stands up and very boldly walks into the middle of this game and calls this shot or whatever it was he was calling. But the point was that he was saying penalty, which of course, Anglicismo for penalty. And then from that point forward, it breaks out into this Spanish with these kids. And I realized at that moment that our children played in Spanish, that they may not have spoken Spanish at home with us and were refusing actually to speak Spanish with us. They didn't feel comfortable doing it. Now, why is that? There's someone here who would talk to me always about the language of the womb, right? And this connection to that language that they heard in the mother's womb. Well, both my children were born in Queens, New York. Their mama was living in Queens with their dad, who's from Queens. And I was living a couple of blocks away from where I had grown up across the border in Brooklyn, right? I was living on the other side of the East New York border. I could walk to my mother's house in East New York, or her apartment where I grew up. And so the language they were hearing in my womb was English. When they were born in New York City. We would speak English. That is what we would always speak. And so this idea of forcing language, which is to say, ahora vivimos en Puerto Rico, ahora todo el mundo habla en español. Like, that's traumatic, right? It's language is fluid. Language is expression. Language is emotion. I think about before we were parents, there was one particular trip that Ivan and I made here. And I said, vamos a practicar el español. Let's only speak in Spanish. And we would do it. That shit would last 10 minutes. 10 minutes in, someone would break and say something in English without even considering or thinking about it. And I remember saying to him on that trip, like, damn, we have an English relationship, right? Like, for however much we tried, we couldn't adhere to a Spanish-only environment. It would be only a matter of time before he and I would ease back into our English. And the irony is, we actually have a very bilingual, very Spanglish relationship because it is both our realities, right? So we will flow in and out of Spanish ourselves if left to our own devices. But this idea to set a parameter that would say that we could only speak Spanish at that moment was very contrived. It didn't work for us as adults. How could we impose that on our children? That day, that night that we saw our children just flow with the kids on the playground, we realized that certain situations called for certain ways of expressing, much like you're not going to speak to your grandparents the way you speak to your boys on the block or whatever. Like, it's okay to flow in and out of language. And it also speaks to this very colonial, very, I should say, imperial view around language, which is to say that, the US, a place that prides itself on being the leaders of the free world. I'm not even going to get into, in this particular episode, my thoughts around colonialism, around imperial violence and genocide. The conversation of what is happening in the world today in so many places and to Palestine is such a long and loaded conversation, and one that is very near and dear to my heart. Imperialism is imperialism is imperialism, and the violence is waged in so many overt and covert ways, subliminal ways. And language has been one of those places of violence, right? Not violence like we see happening today, where people's lives are taken, where we are watching ethnic cleansing, but it has been a very similar, long, drawn-out process. When I talk about being removed from our essence, we're talking about the decimation of indigenous languages, the imposition of colonizer languages. And so, por lo más que habla los Estados Unidos de cómo de inteligentes son o lo que sea, it has always been preposterous to me that it is a society that frowns upon foreign languages, even though English itself is a very foreign language on those soils of Turtle Island. And so you go to other places, even Europe, it is custom for people to speak several languages. Anywhere else in the world, I think, especially for those of us who are so committed to studying and researching, what is it to know other languages? It's having access to more information. It's the ability to read other books. It's the ability to speak with more people, make more friends, know other cultures. It is the most expansive, intelligent thing you can do to learn 1, 2, 3 more languages. Pedro Albizu Campos spoke like 7 languages. Ramon Emeterio Betances lived the majority of his life in Paris and wrote in French. And so these are things that we must consider around what does it mean to not know Spanish? Is it the shame that we don't know our cultural tongue? Or is it the shame of being confronted with our own colonization, that we now speak the language of the colonizer? And so to demystify that experience of living in the States and speaking English is to consider that those who live in the archipelago are speaking the language of the former colonizer. ¿Cuál es la diferencia? So to speak Spanish was like with Pedro Albizu Campos and the critiques around him upholding Spanish culture, becoming a Catholic, which, by the way, he became a Catholic. I think I learned this from Anthony de Jesus, who used to be director of El Centro de Estudio Puertorriqueño, who went to Harvard and did a lot of research around Pedro Albizu Campos' time in Harvard. And so the idea that he was converted to Catholicism, or didn't become a Catholic here in Puerto Rico, but actually picked it up from the Irish communities in Boston, and that Irish independence movements, Irish liberation was very much a sort of strategy and inspiration in what came to be his Puerto Rican nationalism. Using the Spanish language and talking about Catholicism as the Spanish religion became a strategy for combating and resisting the imposed US imperialism that was literally enforcing English only in its schools, in its court system, and also imposing Protestantism, replacing the churches, the Catholic churches, or not necessarily replacing them, but just a really active conversion campaign to Protestantism churches all over, Protestant churches all over the archipelago. And another thing that was seen is for the prevalence of espiritismo in Puerto Rico in the late 19th century, the severe reduction de los centros espiritistas por Puerto Rico because of the Protestantism that was being brought in by the US. So to consider that the shame that we feel coming back to Puerto Rico and not speaking Spanish, how very much different is it to then consider the shame of speaking the former colonizers' language and knowing so little of our indigenous languages, of our West African languages, which ironically, our Spanish here in Puerto Rico has still retained so much of those indigenous to here and African elements. And still, it is the primary language here. It is Spanish. Mostly everything exists in Spanish. It has been centuries of that. And so the national identity around what being Puerto Rican is will be in Spanish, with many other influences in our language. Something that always has bothered me here is this need to let people know that they speak English. It doesn't happen everywhere, but it will happen in more tourist places. So say like here in the Northwest around Aguadilla, definitely in Área Metro, drives me crazy if you try to speak Spanish and someone detects any inkling of an accent, they will insist on speaking to you in English, and they need to let you know that they speak in English, and they will try to be like, yo, you don't have to speak Spanish to me because I speak English. And it's like, but I want to speak Spanish, but they're going to keep speaking in English. And so in those moments, it makes it difficult for you to even practice and to converse. You would probably have to say, you may probably have to insist, prefiero hablar en español. But in doing that, it is important to consider consent around language. We cannot impose language, just like I picked that up with my children, just like I've learned that with myself. I have had people come here and say, háblame en español. You don't do that to me. Here is the reason. Although it may seem that I speak Spanish, I have my own trauma around language. When language is imposed on me, and when people tell me how to speak, it literally brings me to another dark place where all of a sudden my tongue forgets how the fuck to speak. I am speaking Spanish because it took a long, painstaking effort to recover my Spanish, the Spanish that I had and that I lost. I had to bust my ass to recover it. So when you police my language and my tongue, it will literally disrupt the flow of my expression. It's almost like something in me, whether it's my inner child, doesn't want to speak to you anymore. I have also had the same experience with whoever it is I speak with. If there's a person that I know sees eye to eye with me and that I feel comfortable with, my language just flows beautifully. If it's a person that I feel uncomfortable around, a person that I have any sense que tiene cualquier tipo de comemierdería that I feel like they're looking at me from a place of superiority, my tongue will not speak to you. Whatever the fuck Spanish I know will be forgotten. It's almost my body's like passive aggressive way of being like, I don't want to talk to this person. I don't want to talk to them so much that I'm going to forget what the hell words to say. It's been really interesting because that may be a moment en que me tengo que defender. And I need to do that most eloquently or most brashly or whatever. But for that, I need my language. And in those moments, I tend to forget my words. That has been a really interesting dynamic here. If I am around another Nuyorican, I could speak Spanish so fluidly because that is what's familiar to me. Because I grew up as a Nuyorican with relatives that only spoke Spanish. And that is the most familiar Spanish to me. Quizá por ahí hay una abuelita, who was born around the same time as my abuelita. And maybe I could flow with her too. I don't know if, like I said, that Spanish from the 50s, that being another time, that is what's most familiar to me. In terms of learning, it's just really important to maybe make a deliberate, and talking about consent around language, I don't think it would be interesting if this exists, if there are some linguists out there or people who have done this work, in particular around our community, that speak to this idea of consent and that speak to this idea of consent around language. I would love to hear about that. And I'm going to have to research that and see if it exists, because language is so interesting, how it's been this colonial imposition, but that we police ourselves with it as well. We police ourselves and each other with it, which doesn't help at all. And so with that said, perhaps creating these sort of like pods where we enter into spaces with people and we can make an agreement as adults, consenting adults, and bring children, if we bring children into these spaces, that we be very transparent with children and say, within this space, we are going to do this, right? And then it's an understanding that those spaces are designed specifically for the practice of whatever language. But when you go in there and you're like, no, aquí no te puede expresar en tal forma, like it's not, it doesn't really help the fluidity of language. Growing up, we would have debates on this, or when I was a younger adult, like conversations around what is best for children, and bilingual households where one parent spoke one language, the other parent spoke another language. And that is how it was ensured that the children will have that base, right, for each language. Or in this household, they speak this, in that household, they speak that. Also, a practice has been, and it tends to be what people do here, it's parents will only speak Spanish here in the home, knowing that they send their kids specifically to private schools or bilingual schools, which are actually English schools and not bilingual schools, to have their children learn English. Something creepy that I have witnessed here, and for me it's creepy. Ya by a certain age, like junior high por ahí, I am seeing a tendency, at least here in el noroeste, where, and these are the kids coming out of these so-called bilingual schools, where I'm now seeing kids conversing in English amongst themselves. And it has been very problematic for us who rely on our schools to set up that Spanish community for our children. Well, these communities are no longer emphasizing Spanish. Once a kid learns English, a kid from here, from Puerto Rico, in these environments, no voy a decir, yo no tengo la experiencia con las escuelas públicas. As I had mentioned, we put our kids into a private bilingual school, wanting them to have that bilingual experience and also wanting to ensure that they weren't going to go through the whole Americanization element. And so I recognize that their education is more unique. But what I am seeing, and we are in a different school now, and where we are is not a school where the administration is conscious in that way. This is a bigger school connected to a university. And so their education is falling in line with the colonial plan, right? And that colonial plan, another element that I see in the schools in this region, they take kids on trips to Washington, D.C. Very interesting to me. Kids are learning to speak English from TV. That's what they would do in the past. I understand they would learn English from TV. That's what they would do in the past. Now I'm imagining that it's the internet. In fact, I also wanted to say that when I talk about the anglicismos and what's being used here versus what's being used there, that was my experience growing up. and I don't think that's the truth anymore because of the internet. Like, it really bothers me to hear people in, like, white middle-aged women in Kentucky using the same slang of young Black men in the Bronx. Like, I think that the internet has kind of created this flattened view of language and slang and culture, pop culture, and most of the time it's youth of color setting those standards of culture that get then co-opted by the world. A little creepy, but that I diverge from. So I think that there's more of an understanding. The internet is helping to close the gap between what we live in the diaspora and what we live here in Puerto Rico. Just wanted to share that. But this idea that the kids are learning through TV, through movies, through internet, how to speak English and do these bilingual schools, which are English mostly schools. And once that conversational English has been established among them, I don't really see them going back. Our kids were already speaking in English at home. And so now that they're entering adolescence, we see that they're around less and less opportunities to speak Spanish. Their peer groups, those children, less and less are speaking Spanish. And a lot of these children, most of these children, with a few exceptions, are children that were born and raised here. Where do I go now? Now I have had to reconsider whether I incorporate these Spanish-only spaces because I cannot have them lose their Spanish. Perhaps another podcast for another time is talking about the colonial influence on education here. that is much, it goes much deeper than language, goes around content and the textbooks that are used and so many other layers. And that idea of rechazo is a place that I have certainly felt the fire. Even in those schools, or the first school where there was that effort to not be that indoctrinating, Americanizing, institution of learning, there would be teachers that would make their way in there that were like hella pro statehood or hella pro-American, and would come in with this very self-loathing mindset. And so it has been very difficult to combat that. I have experienced that as a Nuyorican mother. And I want to state that yo no rechazo el término Nuyorican, but I have never identified as a Nuyorican. I identify very much as an artist with the Nuyorican culture, because culturally, lo que es la poesía y el arte and the music that has come out of the New York Boricua community is a whole other nation in and of itself. And I am a product of that, and I was raised in that. But I never used the term Nuyorican because I was always so Brooklyn centric. I was always so I would always say, if I had to call myself anything, it would be Brooklyn Rican or a Brooklyn Boricua, which is what I would normally say. When I use the term Nuyorican here, I am speaking to a very different way of using the term Nuyorican, and that is the stereotype here that everybody and their mother's Nuyorican. Pues no importa si llegaste de Florida, de Filadelfia, de donde quiera que tú llegaste, aquí te van a decir Nuyorican. Actually, my husband used to be called Nuyorican, even though his family, he was born and raised in New York to Colombian parents. And there was someone here that would call him a Nuyorican. Okay, just to talk about this flattening of our experiences to make it one massive stereotype in the eyes of people who may not understand it and don't care to know its intricacies. You're this, we're going to call you that. Esto es lo que tú eres. Porque aquí son bien famosos a decirle a uno quién son, en vez de escuchar, esta es la persona quien soy, esta es mi identidad. So I've had to deal with a bunch of ignorant teachers who would treat you differently because of where you're from and who you are, and would single out your child because of that as well. Pero interesantemente, cuando llegan estudiantes que son americanitos y no hablan el español de igual forma, now they have them hooked up with, oh yeah, you could use Google Translate during the test, and they have all these little mechanisms to support those children in their transition. But the child of the Nuyorican, quote unquote, is expected to like bust their ass and figure shit out on their own. So yeah, in closing, I would just encourage everyone to sit with themselves first around language and our relationship to it. Demystify for ourselves, maybe make a list of what emotions and feelings come up for us when we think about our relationship to all the languages we speak. Whether we speak English, whether we speak Spanish, whether we speak Spanglish, whether we're bilingual, whether we speak street, because I speak street too. And what is our relationship to each language? What are the feelings that each evokes for us? What is that language of the crib? What is that language of the home? What is that language of the womb that really evokes wonderful memories for us? What is that language most attached to trauma? What is that language attached to love? Ironically, I grew up praying in Spanish, like God was Boricua and didn't understand English. Because I would pray with my family in Brooklyn, and all those oraciones were in Spanish. Whenever I had to pray, and it still happens to me, my mind will automatically resort to Spanish, right? So then there may be areas in our lives that we think a certain way. What is the language we think in? For me, I think differently in different situations, right? Certain thoughts are thought of in English and certain thoughts are thought of in Spanish. When I'm going to write, it's gotten to a point now that depending on what I write, it may come in a different language, and I will always honor the language that the writing comes in. That's why with my blog on Rematriating Boriken, there's some blog posts that start in English, there's some that start in Spanish, and I've never made it a point to make it bilingual, that everything has to exist in two languages, but just to honor the language that it first flowed in. And you will see, of course, that the majority happen in English. That's how my brain thinks. But before we can start to navigate coming someplace else and holding it down someplace else and how we're received someplace else, we first need to navigate our own feelings and connections to our own tongues. Understand that. Because if we don't have that right, then we're going to get fucking bulldozed. Y así me pasó a mí. I was completely embarrassed and ashamed when I first got here. Anything anybody said, I was like going to go running home. And the worst that happened to me, talking about teaching and the kids making fun of me, one kid once said, I no speak de Spanish. And it was, yeah, like I lasted teaching 2 years. That was not going to happen. I was about to get arrested. Por el descaro, por Betito, their children, in this case, it was a teenager, but to stand there at that moment and have the history, the decades-long history of my people in New York being shamed in schools for not speaking English. I know speaking the English, that's what we heard growing up, or I didn't experience that. I was born there, but I know that my parents did. I know that my father wasn't educated in New York. My mother was. But going into offices, anything that these folks tried to do, my father arrived in New York at the age of 16. To this day, at 81, he still has an accent. Same thing with my husband's father, right? So to consider what it means to come back home and be met with that bullshit, I would be so offended standing before these children, but would have to tell myself, these children are the products of their parents. And this is how this stuff gets passed on. And what we are needing is for folks to boldly come back and forth and be authentically our own selves, not try to assimilate either way. That we want to speak Spanglish, it's okay because Kat's here speaking Spanglish. With what reason? Dame un break. Voy para el shopping, quiere fafu. Aquí se hablan esos anglicismos. And it's not just the statehooders, it's like across the board. So that's something to consider when we hold ourselves to these impossible standards of perfection so we can fit in. Think about the colonial implications of assimilation. And it's different when you are coming to your home, ancestral home community. But we also need to check ourselves on those parameters we set. Ensure that we're not policing ourselves, because then that's not rematriation. That's like self-humiliation. You know what I'm saying? All things to be considered.
Thank you so much for listening to the Rematriating Boriken Podcast. You could look out for future episodes every new and full moons. This is Yasmín Hernández, an artist, a writer, and cultural organizer, born and raised in Brooklyn, Rematriating Boriken, now in my 10th year here. If you are visiting Puerto Rico, you're welcome to stop by my art space in Mayagüez, CucubaNación. For more information on the Rematriating Boriken project, you can visit Rematriating Borikén, that's BORIKEN.com. And there you will find the blog and also the manifesto and the portrait series, Portraits from the Trench. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes with some of the folks featured in that project. Learn more about their journeys. Thanks again for listening.